The conversation about the Washington, D.C. issue is sort of there's sort of two facets to the conversation. And I have two different interviews that we're going to be focusing on this. One is about the issue of policing and crime in America, which is an issue of a resource crunch all over America. And that is one conversation to have. But the other conversation to have is this role of the military in domestic policing. And that's where I want to begin. My guest right now is Janessa Goldbeck. She's a Marine Corps veteran. She's currently the CEO of the Vet Voice Foundation. It's a national nonprofit that mobilizes veterans and military families to be civic leaders and policy advocates. And as you know, if you've heard me rant about leadership in America, I believe sort of the ideal here is we kind of need our military veterans to help sober up the country's polarization. I'm convinced that the military in many ways has been the ideal to show how we're all Americans first. And I think in many ways, military veterans at least have the best perspective of being generally. I'm not saying there's always veterans specifically that are in one camp or another, but generally somebody that comes from a military background is able to see the country as one first before seeing people as blue or red, et cetera. So I think that's why this is an important conversation. Now, it's worth noting that one of Janessa's focuses is on opposing. She's outspoken against the use of deploying troops for domestic policing, and that's why I want to get the conversation started. So, Janessa, welcome to the ToddCast.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with just give me your origin story, your time in the military, what got you into the military, why'd you stay as long as you did, and how you ended up where you are today.
Yeah, well, I had kind of a unusual path in. I started my career out as a human rights advocate, working to push the U.S. government to be better about protecting civilians in conflict zones. I studied abroad in East Africa as an undergrad, learned about the genocide that was unfolding in Darfur, Sudan, and became part of that movement, moved to D.C. right out of college to do that work professionally. And at that time, I had really no connection to the military other than my grandparents having served in World War II. I didn't know anybody who had joined the military or was currently deployed. But working in human rights advocacy in conflict zones, I learned very quickly how important it was to have security forces providing that corridor for our humanitarian operations. And it really exposed me to a whole different side of the military that I knew had existed. And I saw firsthand that there was a big disconnect between our humanitarians on the ground and the people providing security forces. And I thought, what a better way to get that experience than to actually join the military, get a master's degree in military speak, so to speak. So at 26 years old, if you're going to join the military, you might as well go all the way in. I decided to join the Marine Corps as an officer, went to Quantico, was designated as a combat engineer officer, and then really fell in love with the military writ large. You spoke at the beginning of your comments about how the military represents sort of American ideals writ large. And that's really true. You are working with people from all walks of life, all backgrounds. And being an officer in particular, getting to lead and learn from your Marines and sailors is a real privilege. So stayed in for 7 years, got out, and now I've been leading this organization to help elevate the voices of other veterans who really are concerned about what's happening in our country today.
Well, you're right. That is an unusual path. And it's like, what a gutsy decision you made. And at the same time, good for you. I mean, this is regrets is the wrong word. It's an experience I wish I had.
Well, I'll tell you, I grew up in Southern California, and my parents were a pretty hippy dippy, vegetarian pacifists.
Right.
And when I came out to them, they were like, "We love you no matter what." And when I told them I was leaving human rights advocacy to join the Marine Corps, they were appalled. These are not the values they'd raised me with. So a little bit of a different experience than a lot of my peers joining the Marines or that I served with. But at the end of the day, that stuff gets set aside. Right. When you're digging a hole in the rain or carrying a heavy load, like, it doesn't matter where you were raised or what your background is. People just want to know that you're competent, you can do your job, and that you'll have their back. And I think we've really gotten away from so much of that in our society. There's very few experiences people have like that with people that are different than themselves.
No, this is why I'm somebody who thinks we should have mandatory national service. I think what the Israelis do when everybody has to serve for 2 years, it sort of it elevates the importance of citizenship and sort of the duty. And I think that how else are we going to get red and blue to understand each other?
I 100% agree.
Yeah.
And I think in a nation that has a shortage of law enforcement officials and nurses and teachers, like there's a lot of different ways that public service could be, a lot of different ways you could serve. And I would absolutely love to see that. I think it's a huge potential for this country to take something like that on.
And I think that what a lot of Americans don't realize is how often the Marines are a police force overseas, but in a humanitarian, which is about protecting those. I mean, look, I don't want to have a Gaza conversation, but there's a part of me that wishes that send in the Marines and we'll get everybody fed. Like, I'm convinced of that. Like, it's get everybody out of the way and we'll get everybody fed. Again, not gonna. We're here to talk about a separate discussion, but explain that, because the importance of that. Sometimes you do have political leaders who say, well, they do this overseas. Why shouldn't we ask them to do it over here?
That's right. Well, I mean, the Marine Corps is a no-fail mission organization. Like, you get a task, whether you're a lance corporal, a captain, or a general, like, you're going to complete that task. And that is the whole orientation of everyone who wears a Marine Corps uniform. And so regardless of how complicated it is, there's going to be a way to get it done. You don't need to have the right equipment. We always call it a 70% solution. Like, you figure it out with what you've got. And even if it isn't perfect, you're going to get it done. So I do think there is a gut instinct for people who want to have solutions quickly to use the military in that way. But one of the things that makes America special is that we have drawn a very clear and distinct line between the military and domestic civilian policing. And the reason that we do that is because they are very different missions. It's one thing to go kick down a bunch of doors and, set a perimeter and establish a base of operations. It's another thing to quell civil disobedience, to police in a way that actually improves community safety. And so this president is sending uniformed military who are not necessarily trained for the missions they're being asked to do into the streets. We saw this in LA with the Marine Corps being deployed as a force to protect federal property, an infantry battalion that's trained to lay rounds down range, being asked to do domestic policing, and this escalating set of missions for the National Guard, who are people who signed up to protect the homeland from foreign threats and to respond to things like natural disasters, not police their friends and neighbors.
So, it's interesting, the training you get for these missions that are both humanitarian and security, and what is it that makes them different than the training you would get in the National Guard to deal with, a natural disaster that knocks the power out, and you need kind of some security to make sure people are getting food, et cetera?
Well, I can speak from my experience as a Marine and a Marine that was attached to an infantry battalion. The force that we saw deployed in Los Angeles, those were infantry Marines. Their primary mission is to close with and destroy the enemy. That is very different from a police officer's oath to serve and protect and de-escalate. The Marine Corps, especially the infantry, is by nature, escalatory force. For the National Guard, their training is a little different. They are trained for civil disturbances and to respond peaceably and peacefully to those things, and to help local law enforcement when it's requested. What's been so different about this iteration, whether it's LA, Washington, D.C., or whatever city we're going to see the president deploy National Guard to next, is that local law enforcement and local leaders have said, this is not necessary. This is escalatory. It's actually inflammatory. And we have the situation under control. And in Los Angeles, you actually saw the sheriff and the chief of police of the LAPD, which is not like a notoriously woke organization, come out and say, like, sending the National Guard and the Marines here is really escalatory. Please do not do it. And so I think this president is actively seeking to provoke protest, to use protest as a means and mechanism for further militarization, as a way of getting us used to seeing troops in the streets. And in my view, the end game is using the military to police the next election.
Well, I understand that concern and I don't want to dismiss it, but let me start with how the mayor of DC, Muriel Bowser, has been how about that? This is probably the best phrase to use. She's been de-escalatory, right? She's saying, look, I'm uncomfortable with this. At the same time, I've needed more resources, right? She's been, as a friend of mine noted the other day, she's been a walking billboard for looking for more cops, right? Please, we need more people to do this. And so she's chosen the route of saying, well, we appreciate that the federal government wants to help us out, right? And she's using it as additional resources. Do you worry that she's been too cooperative? Do you think that she should be, or she's in a unique circumstance where the president does have authority over her city in a way that, frankly, no other police force or no other mayor has to deal with?
She is in a very unique position, and it's a very challenging position to be in. And I'm not in the business of necessarily armchair quarterbacking elected leaders in the moment when they're responding to sort of unprecedented things. But there are a couple notes I would offer the mayor if she's listening. One is that, there is a way to call out how disingenuous this offer is from the president, or this attempt is. Congress has a lot of influence over DC. The president has a lot of influence, and DC's budget. There's been a budget shortfall for police officers in Washington, DC. If they were serious about this, they could have handled it through fiscal mechanisms. There's also this idea that they're going to take the police department's authority away and give it to the attorney general, Pam Bondi. I can't think of a single police chief I've ever met with or interacted with that would appreciate their authority being undermined by a federal official. And there's a lot of questions about operationally how this is going to work. In a normal situation, if the president had gone to the mayor and said, if this was a truly from his heart desire to quell crime and not a political stunt, could have gone to the mayor and said, hey, I have resources, you can request them, and we'll go through the normal channels and we can deploy them as you see fit and as local leaders see fit. But that's not what's happened here. The president has said, DC is a city full of crime and bedlam and all of the escalatory things that he said, and against sort of the wishes or the requests, and without coordination with local leadership, has just declared this state of emergency.
Yeah, I know. This is the political trap he sets, which is almost like and this is sort of the debate. And I just had it with somebody not too long ago, about an hour or so ago, about the issue of if you don't take his bait, right? If you sort of say, great, thank you very much, he'll lose interest, right? In some ways, did he do this because he thinks DC needs more resources? Or did he do this hoping there would be a large pushback and therefore allowing him to do even more? And that if he does have a habit of, if he's trying to pick a fight, nobody wants to fight, he moves and goes finds another fight. I vacillate whether that's a good idea or not, right? I think that I understand in Trump 2.0 the idea of sort of like, not everything needs to go to 11 like it did in 1.0, and yet the collective resistance of 1.0, I think, did frame the larger conversation correctly. So where are you on this?
Yeah, well, I don't think Trump is playing, 3 or 4D chess. I think he
never does.
Running to the latest thing.
It's always checkers.
Right. Yeah.
And it's always like the dumbest form of checkers.
Yes,
Sorry.
exactly. Yeah. He saw this kid in front of him, bloody. A pal of his picked up the phone and called him, and he went to 11 in DC. That's sort of the most generous maybe interpretation. If I were to, apply a little, if there's a little more strategy to it, I think you're totally right. I mean, the administration's strategy has been from day one is like, let's light 1,000 things on fire, see what kicks. They've got things they need to distract people from. The big, beautiful bill, which is going to rip people's healthcare away, close rural hospitals, the Epstein files. All these things are things they don't want at the top of the news cycle. So, any other fire they can light is a good one. But what we saw in LA was, I think they expected to see some real violent protests as a result of the militarization, which didn't unfold. And the president and the secretary of defense, sort of eventually just dialed it back down to, a low grade, tiny little deployment, a couple hundred guys left just sitting around looking at their phones. So I think it's a little of both, but either way, what I feel like is happening and is likely to continue happening in more and more places is this sort of just continued sense that it's okay and normal for the military and National Guard to be deployed to do civilian missions.
And I guess that's take me back to your time in the military, because I up until frankly this current set of what the president's been doing, and he couldn't politicize the military in his first term, right? Mattis wouldn't allow it. He got it. He decided to pick his own chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and Mark Milley was just not going to, he wasn't going to cooperate. It's now, he's now got a more compliant defense secretary than he did before. Talk about did you ever run into anybody trying to play politics, and how did the leadership de-escalate at the time?
I came in a really interesting time. Don't Ask, Don't Tell was actually repealed while I was at Quantico for my basic officer training.
Interesting.
So within the first cohort of officers that could serve openly, I signed my contract under Don't Ask, Don't Tell relatively naively, thinking like, nobody's going to care, without realizing how destructive that could have been to my career. So I was able to serve, very much as myself. It mattered a lot, and it didn't matter at all, right? Like I could just bring my whole self to the job without looking over my shoulder. I also was pretty stunned to learn when I joined in 2012 that there were jobs in the federal government, in the DoD specifically, that were closed to women simply on the basis of gender. We couldn't even compete for them. And I really wanted to be an infantry officer. That is like one of the things that motivated me to join the Marine Corps, was the boots on the ground aspect of that job in particular. And so I worked behind the scenes with a number of other people to advocate for the repeal when I could, in a nonpartisan way, helping advise some of the folks who were speaking to people up the Hill about that. And there were certainly people who disagreed with kind of all of the things I just laid out: women in combat arms jobs, gay people being able to serve openly. And there were people in my career who I would say went out of their way to make life harder for me, but the vast majority didn't. Because at the end of the day, people, like I said earlier, the orientation is do your job, do it well, be someone who's dependable, and the rest of it doesn't really matter.
Do you really feel like your time was a meritocracy?
Absolutely. And in fact, when the combat exclusion policy was repealed, and people could finally, women could finally start competing for combat arms jobs, there were a number of women who attempted and didn't pass the standard. And then people started training to the standard, and then they started getting those jobs and then succeeding in those jobs. And it really, there was no, shockwave through the service. People grumble, people bring their own prejudices and gripes to any job. But at the end of the day, you're all wearing the same uniform. Everybody's uniform says U.S. Marines across your chest, and you're just there to do your job. And there are things that are more important than that. What we have now at the head of the Secretary of Defense, who has just made culture wars his number one priority, to rip apart any sort of recognition or any sort of understanding that people who bring different backgrounds to the fight are actually strengthening the U.S. military, is just, I think he's doing generational harm to the military, to our civ-mil relationship, between how the U.S. population or civilians sees the military, whether or not they respect them. And these missions also increasingly kind of blur the lines between the military being a tool that's there to serve and defend America, rather than a tool of the president's own domestic political control.
Yeah, I was just going to say, just troop cohesion. right? Like I gotta think that this has been very disruptive. I mean, look, I've seen the polling of troops. Okay, we know there's a red lean, okay, to the rank and file military. Maybe it
Absolutely.
depends. Maybe it's 60-40, maybe it's 55-45. It all depends, right? But there's, because for a variety of reasons. Do you get the sense that this current Secretary of Defense almost wants to grow that even more? Do you feel as if that there's an attempt only recruit like-minded? I mean, has recruiting changed, or is it becoming self-selecting? Because that seems to me that could create a problem for troop cohesion going forward.
Oh, 100%. Well, first of all, I think it's really important to pick up on the first part of your comment, the split 60-40, 55-45. The last couple of presidential elections, we've seen veterans and active duty military flip-flop between supporting Biden in 2020, or a huge majority shifting towards Biden in 2020 to people shifting back to Trump in 2024, which tells you a little bit about some of the apoliticalness or the independent nature of a lot of people in the military. I do think there's a perception among Democrats that the military and veterans are writ large conservative, and 45.
Well, it drives me nuts. They almost treat it as a hostile constituency group, which becomes self-reinforcing if you're not careful.
Absolutely, and a real misstep in my opinion, because 40-45% of any demographic is not something you want to leave on the table in any election, especially as ones as close as our national elections have been in recent years. And there are a lot of people who are not attached to any political party who are willing to be persuaded, if you're speaking their language. So I think that's an important first point. The second point, your question, is Pete Hegseth intentionally trying to create division and recruit a force that meets his vision of a white, Christian fascist state?
Right.
Absolutely. And we've seen him fire generals who are women and people of color. We've seen him denigrate the service of people who have served commendably and honorably, who are trans, to actually institute a policy where if people don't have gender dysphoria noted in their medical record, but someone thinks they're trans or non-binary, that they should be outed by their peers. That there was a partisan political rally at Fort Bragg with the president speaking to uniformed troops in a partisan manner and selling racist merch. Like, all of these things should shock the conscience. And I think one of the most disturbing things about the era that we're in is that not a single active duty military leader has come forward and been willing to sacrifice their career to speak out. And that
that is a curiosity to me, because this is a larger theme. I address it today, which is the difference between Trump 1.0 and Trump 2.0. Is that look, there was sort of collective pushback in Trump 1.0, and I think because you had Republicans in Congress speaking out, it stiffened the spine of others to do it too. And now we are the Republican Party is speaking as one, right? Those that wanted, that felt uncomfortable with Hegseth literally got harassed into confirming him. Literally harassed by people outside their house, going after family members. I mean, it was it is an undercovered part of the Hegseth confirmation, is what happened in particular with whether it's Tom Tillis or Joni Ernst, two of the, and here's the thing, none of us are in their shoes. So I am empathetic of, we don't, everybody handles this stuff differently. But I imagine it's quite difficult for somebody in the military who on one hand doesn't want to be seen as partisan at all and doesn't want to make what somebody will label a political stand. And yet Donald Trump has turned any criticism into partisanship, right? Which is like, if you criticize the president's you must be a liberal, which is like, no, just because I'm not a conservative doesn't make me a liberal, right? Like, and I'm sure many in the military feel that way. It's like, hey, I'm independent for a reason. And I mean, I guess do you empathize with these military leaders that are, I think many of them would like to speak out, but to what end is what they might say. So give the case to what end.
I'm empathetic, but I'm not sympathetic, because I believe that with power comes responsibility. And When I look at
Spider-Man, always, right? The Spider-Man meme is always true. Yes, I agree.
I mean, I look at Joni Ernst, who built her career on being a survivor of sexual assault, of being a proud military veteran, and then voted to confirm Pete Hegseth. And I understand, I've heard rumors that she was being harassed, viciously. But
Staff too. They targeted
100%.
everybody. I mean, it is. Look, this is they targeted. They target family members. They go after staff's family members. It is,
which is despicable. But
it is extraordinary.
Right. You're a sitting U.S. senator, and we're one vote away, right. And you're going to, I don't know, sacrifice everything you've stood and fought for your entire career because of fear of retribution. Like that, to me, if you're in that position to make that decision and you're making a decision out of fear, we've already lost our democracy. And your role as senator is not real. You don't have any power anymore. So what do you actually have to lose if all of your decisions are dictated by the president? So that is how I feel about members of Congress who have totally abdicated their responsibility to be a third branch of government. On the military side, I do have more sympathy because, these are folks who signed up to serve in an apolitical manner and now are being forced into this very partisan political moment. But the fact that there isn't one general officer who is willing to say, you know what, the country is worth more than my pension. And I understand that this may put me and my family and people I love in danger. Like that really concerns me. And we saw it in the first Trump administration when people like Lieutenant Colonel Alex Vindman, reported Trump's corruption and lost his career and went through the ringer as a result of it. But it just really stands out to me that there is no one willing to say. And I've spoken to a few people who are still in the building, and they're like, I'm doing what I can to protect the people below me and slow roll policies that I think will maybe disappear in a couple.
I hear this. Look, I hear this too. Hey, if I go, you don't understand who replaces me.
Right.
Right. I've heard that too. Right. Yeah.
But, at the end of the day, like we are seeing across every sector a real lack of courage. I think institutions bowing to the whims of the president, willing to basically pay bribes to avoid the president's wrath. And what has that gotten them? It's not like he's going to stop. He's a thug, and he is using the presidency to enrich himself.
Everything you need to know, we were taught in the children's book, if you give a mouse a cookie.
That's exactly.
I mean, I get it. I'm obsessed. I say it a lot on this podcast, but it's like, that does feel like what Trump 2.0 has been, which is like, maybe we can placate him with this, all right, take the cookie now. And
this time the mouse has a gun, not a cookie.
Yeah. So let's talk about the conversation that's happening in veterans communities, right? Because there's definitely I think there's a lot of veterans I talk to who are like very disturbed by Trump, not comfortable with the Democrats, and feel kind of politically homeless, right? I'm sure this is a conversation you have quite frequently. What do you say to them? What do you tell them? And what's the best way to engage them?
Well, I feel equally frustrated with the Democrats. I think we've seen a lot of fecklessness and unwillingness to adapt to the current situation that we're in, to, treat President Trump's actions as if we're living in 1995 and there is some, one national news broadcast they can go on and talk to Chuck Todd and change, everyone's opinions.
Yeah, that's just not how it works anymore, right?
It's not. And so it's an unwillingness to adapt to the new media environment. It's an unwillingness to adapt to the new realities that we're not dealing with an administration that cares at all about norms, and to treat it like what it is, which is a person and an organization seeking perpetual power and to enrich themselves and the people who have helped them gain power. So, it's interesting, though, because we do work to help veterans get elected. I run a nonpartisan organization, but it's the sister organization of an organization called Vote Vets that works to get left of center vets elected. And what we see in a lot of those races, many of them in red and purple places, people are disgusted or disappointed by the Democrats. They're horrified by the Trump administration and the MAGA movement, but they like the individual candidates running who are veterans and Democrats. And I think that kind of speaks to what a veteran means to a lot of voters who might be independent or moderate on either side of the aisle. And I do think that voters still truly believe, because it's real, that veterans kind of speak both languages because they've had to work with people of all stripes. And, their oath is to the Constitution, not one party or one person.
So that gets at another debate that's happening on the left. And that gets at, when do you fight fire? When do you fight fire with fire? And when do you stand on principle? Right. And I'll just be honest. I think that what Donald Trump wants is for everybody to break the rules like he does. And he, because he knows how to win those fights. He knows how to live in that world, a world without rules where it's just winners and losers. If you're on the winning side, the majoritarian side, you get to dictate everything. You get to do all this. It's obviously not what our founders intended, right? In fact, the entire point of the Constitution was to protect minority rights, to make sure a tyrannical slim majority couldn't just run over the minority rule, whether it's minority in religion and speech, et cetera. But yet I understand, they're like, well, if he's not going to play fair, why should we play fair? What's the line? How do you, as somebody who comes from a world where if you don't follow protocol, people die. Right. The wrong person might get shot. The wrong person might be. Look, I get it, but I'm still want to believe that the long game is the better game. What say you?
Yeah, I think we're probably talking about some of the partisan redistricting that's happening around the country, or being.
But it's not just that. This is the latest example, but there's a lot of this. It's like, hey, all's fair. I always say there's all's fair in love and war. But actually, there are rules to war, right? We condemn a country that violates the Geneva Conventions. So, like, there is some guardrails that we would like to put on war. Does that mean everybody follows those guardrails? No. But there is this sense of, hey, there should be some guardrail here in how this is conducted. And that gets to this domestic political debate. So, and look, I've had people on the left say, you're being naive. You can't just sit here and hope that norms come back.
Yeah. I think what we're facing more broadly is a crisis of faith that any system or institution can actually positively impact people's lives. And Trump has harnessed the most negative version of that to enrich himself. Whereas Democrats are out there, many Democrats are out there saying, like, we want to change the system to help you, but we want to use process to get things done, and we want to do it by the right process and make sure it's all, good to go, and we're doing as little harm as possible. And what that translates to is it not making a real difference in people's lives in the moment that they see it in. And so I think that we need to be willing, people who want to govern and lead this country need to be willing to look at the power and authority they actually possess in this moment where we have a arsonist at the head of our system of government. I don't think that every Republican is the same. And I think Trump is something unique and special, not in a positive way, but he really has been an aberration and a once in a generation figure. And so I think it is imperative on Democrats to use and other hopefully Republicans too, to use every amount of power they have to push back, with an understanding that power has to be restrained and constrained once we get through this. But it feels a little bit to me like, I live in Southern California. If my house catches on fire, even though we have a drought, I want the firefighters to use that water on my house. And that's what it feels like the moment we're in right now.
No, and I get it. So, look, California is, I don't like the mindset of, hey, it's not fair what Texas is doing, so we're going to punish the minority in California because of what Texas is doing. That's I'm sorry, I think that's a tough position to hold.
Yeah, it doesn't speak to my sense of justice, but it's also, if I'm facing a really scary situation. Like, do I want to be able to defend myself and my home? Absolutely. And I think we're in a really scary situation where this guy is coming for, he already has come for many of my rights. The movement that he represents is coming for the rights and safety of a lot of other people. And I think he needs to be stopped at all costs. But that being said, with guardrails built in, one thing I've heard about Governor Newsom's proposition to put something on the ballot that would redistrict California is that there would be a trigger mechanism where it only takes place if Texas actually goes through with it, and it has a sunset clause where the independent redistricting commission comes back. Now, do I love this? Like, you break the rules, so we're going to break the rules? No, but it is an authority that the governor has, and at this stage of the game, I think it's really important that we exercise all authority we have.
Look, I get it, right? And it's and yet at the same time, I worry about the unintended consequence of it, right? That it becomes all of a sudden we have a war between the states.
Well, and people, I get asked this question a lot by folks left of center, and they're like, when is the military going to rise up and refuse these orders? And I think it's important to make clear that there are some legal challenges and questions about the orders that have happened. In fact, just yesterday in California, lawsuit being heard about the legality of Trump's efforts to deploy troops in LA. There are questions about the DC deployment and home rule and all these things, legal technicalities. But so far, none of the orders issued have been blatantly illegal. They've been, in my opinion, lawful but awful. And so we really don't want to get into a place in this country where you've got, Lance Corporal Schmuckatelli or Captain Goldbeck out there saying, well, I'm not really, we don't, the reason we have such a professional and military force is that we make it very clear that you follow an order that's given to you as long as it's lawful. You do have a duty to disobey an unlawful order, but at this point, none of what's been ordered has been unlawful. It's just been norm-shattering. So I think we're in a really dangerous place if we've got, members of the military just making decisions about who they're going to follow based on, who the political leader is. That's not a good place for us to go either.
Look, one of the ways you got on my radar is my friend Jamie Shore, who runs a terrific DC Docs Film Festival. My listeners know I'm obsessed with these film festivals. When I was at Meet the Press, we ran it for 6 years. Jamie was my partner on that. And you were a part of a documentary called War Game back in 2024, which was about, I don't know, what if there's an insurrection during a presidential transition?
Purely hypothetical.
Purely hypothetical. So obviously this was done, and a lot of people have done this. So explain, like I got involved in a war game on Taiwan. Right. We hosted at Meet the Press Reports. I did this whole thing about sort of what would war with China look like over Taiwan. And it was a very sobering experience. And it was, we truncated it because we were trying to put it into 35 minutes. What was explain the scenario that you put out and sort of what was the outcome?
Sure. Well, so in 2023, we got a group of senior administration officials from the last 5 presidential administrations, including the first Trump administration, to get together and war game out a scenario that was focused on presidential transition where the losing candidate refused to concede and called upon radicalized supporters in the active duty military and National Guard to disobey orders and help them take power. And at the time when we crafted this scenario, we were thinking about
some people would call that a coup.
Yeah, some people might call that a coup. But we were looking at the fact that the 2020 election was so heavily contested and conspiracy theoried, and that in a Trump-Biden potential transition that Trump might not accept a loss or a future 2028 transition. And so we really wanted to tease out what are the threats to the good order and discipline of the military. How would the military respond if there were people that were making decisions on their own? How would a president weigh using the Insurrection Act or conducting domestic deployments to quell civil unrest around an election? And we wanted to tease all of those out with a bipartisan cast of characters. So we had Governor Steve Bullock, former governor of Montana, played our president. Senator Heidi Heitkamp was his chief of staff, senior advisor. General Wes Clark played the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Bill Kristol played sort of the MAGA conspiracy theorist head. And then we had a bunch of veterans and experts on extremists playing the actual sort of Proud Boys, Oath Keepers type folks. And the whole thing was the subject of this documentary. They actually brought in this incredible team. Jesse Moss and Tony Gerber were our co-directors. They built these sets for us. So like a White House Situation Room, White House Briefing Room in a hotel that January 6th insurrectionists had actually stayed at during the actual insurrection. And we shot the whole thing on January 6th, 2023. And one of the biggest lessons coming out of this was that actually, while it's important for leaders at the national level to understand the difference between Title 10 and Title 32 and the various authorities the president has to federalize the Guard, it actually was going to be state and local leaders, governors, states attorneys general, et cetera, and adjutant generals of state National Guards that were going to be the real, tip of the spear if this were to occur. And
why is that?
Because that they are the ones who typically will be requesting federal help. So, a governor, there's a riot in LA, the governor needs assistance, the mayor calls the governor calls the president sends assistance. That's typically how it works. Well, in a situation where the president wants to exert authority over a state or a city, they're going to be the ones having to coordinate on the ground to ensure that things don't escalate, that people are safe, that both the troops and civilians are safe, and are going to have to be responding to a political crisis basically caused by the president of the United States. So that the war game, the film War Game, examines that sort of federal problem, the election-related problem. The following year, we went out and did a series of state-level exercises, actually with local electeds, members of the press, and activist groups to help them start thinking about, in a second Trump administration, what might occur in your city or state. And the scenario we actually envisioned for them and had them play out was second Trump administration conducts very aggressive interior immigration enforcement, which leads to protest, which leads to militarization. And that's like one of the worst I told you so's. Like we were hoping that this was hyperbolic and inflammatory. But since then, we've conducted that similar exercise with a number of different governors and mayors' offices around the country and helped them think through, what happens if this happens here.
I thought you were going to say you used the succession scenario where there's arson at the vote counting. Where there was arson at in Wisconsin, in Milwaukee at the vote counting center is how they did it, and all of a sudden votes were just gone.
That's right,
and they could not figure out who won Wisconsin.
I mean, there is. I think we should take this president and this administration at their word. There has been a lot of things said about how elections should or shouldn't be conducted in this country. There is a sustained effort right now to change the rules of ballot receipt deadlines across the country, which disproportionately actually impact vets and military family members who either vote absentee or vote from abroad, or disabled veterans who vote by mail. There's just a million fires on every front, and it is really nuts to me how much of a target the administration has painted directly on the backs of vets and military families.
That's interesting that you put it that way. When you say put a target on them, explain.
Well, I mean, we look at these attacks on voting. We're seeing, that the VA, that it's always been a Republican prerogative to privatize the VA. The VA is the largest public healthcare system in the country and one of the most popular forms of healthcare. There are a lot of, there have been a lot of negative things about the VA over the years, but in the last 20 years, VA healthcare has dramatically improved and expanded to include more people who weren't previously eligible. And the entire VA, the attack on the VA, firing 30,000 workers, removing the collective bargaining rights of doctors and nurses is all an effort to dismantle this public system, to privatize healthcare, which is demonstrably worse for veterans and more expensive to the American taxpayer. So I think there is this perception that, all vets are MAGA and, they are going to follow blindly whatever Trump does, but whether it's the attacks on the VA, the attacks on voting, the misuse of the military domestically, or the firing of federal workers. 30% of the federal workforce are vets. All of these things, I think, are going to have a real electoral impact on Trump as long as we have a free and fair election in 2026.
No, it's always been interesting. Veterans are the one constituency that arguably leaned more Republican during when the party was sort of Bush and Romney, and less. There's been this, and I've noticed it. Right, there really is a libertarian streak among veterans, more so than most, and a sort of is a discomfort with aggressive government. Right, no matter where it concentrated power in any direction.
Yeah, it's actually kind of funny. I used to have this joke with my buddies in the Marines who were self-identified libertarians. You're not supposed to talk politics, but you're out in the field for
we're
weeks.
Humans.
You're talking about stuff,
you're
right?
humans.
Yeah, it's not going to affect whether or not you lay down covering fire for your buddy. You're just talking. But I have these buddies who are self-identified libertarians who would say, like, I'm a libertarian because I want the man to come in and take something. I'm like, bro, you're wearing a U.S. government uniform. You are the man. But I think that there's just a sense, if you've deployed to a place where you've seen authoritarian power or a lack of power or just abuse and misuse of power, it does stick with you, and you want to have the ability to make decisions for yourself that are best for you and your family. I think that's a very human instinct. We're so tribalized now in America, but if we could get back to it's in some way, shape, or form, and it might be a really rough transition, but to a place where we can respect each other and our ability to do those things, I think that would be very healthy for our democracy.
Is there any specific ways, I always say it's like after Trump, I think there needs to be, there were a bunch of things we assumed norms would handle. And it turns out, no, you're going to have to, look, most people aren't going to commit murder, but if you didn't have laws that outlawed it, then you'd have a problem, keeping people from murdering people. Are there any sort of new guardrails, new laws that should be erected around sort of around the idea of preventing the politicizing of the military, something that's, right now, frankly, it feels more norms that have done that in the past. Or maybe it's, protocols, but do we need something stronger?
Yeah, I mean, I think that some of the things that we let slide over the last couple decades, a civilian secretary of defense, someone who is not coming from the
My God, how many times are we passing these waivers? I'm so glad it drives me. Look, I respect General Mattis, and I respect General Petraeus, and all the different, all the times that we've quote unquote done waivers. But the whole point of this,
that's right.
Right. I think we did it with General Austin too.
Yep.
I mean, it's just like, this has been left and right. And you're like, are you really telling me there's no civilian that can do this?
What's qualified to run like this giant bureaucracy?
It's
by the way,
very offensive.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Actually. Yeah.
And I feel the same way about the VA, actually. Like, I don't need a veteran to run the VA. I need someone who's run a major healthcare system before. Or
look, that's why I thought it was inspired when Dennis McDonough was over there, because he actually was somebody who understood how government worked.
Right.
And so ultimately what you really need is somebody that knows where the red tape sticks and where it doesn't. Right. Like, that's an asset. It's great to have a veteran to be there to stick with veterans, but we have a Veterans Affairs for a reason. So you would think anybody in charge of it is going to be that. So I agree with you. It doesn't necessarily, you need somebody that knows how to protect the VA. Absolutely.
I want somebody who is a bean counter and holds people accountable and is a systems thinker. I think there's a couple other things that are so big. I don't know how we accomplish them, but getting money out of politics. I mean, the fact that we can have so much extreme dark money in our politics just incentivizes the fact that we have these really polarizing figures on both sides of the aisle that, I think drives cynicism, and people tune out, and then you don't have people participating, and then you have even more extreme people who win the next round. So that, to me, is one of the biggest horrors that's occurred in our democracy over the last few decades, is the fact that we can just have unlimited sums dumped into these elections. It's a self-licking ice cream cone, and it's a business, but it's a business that's bad for America.
No, and there's a lot of people that profit off of it. And it ain't the voters. That's for sure.
I'll give you my last most extreme idea, which I didn't come up with on my own, but I think is really interesting, which is to expand the House significantly and abolish the U.S. Senate.
Interesting. I'm for doubling. I've been obsessed with this, uncapping the House. I think the founders' intent, we need to double the size of the House. If we had 800 and, my proposal would make it every congressional districts can't be any bigger than 0.0001% of the population, which would be one per 400,000 rather than.
It means you would actually have to be responsive to your constituents.
You might know your member of Congress.
That's
because
right.
They would actually be community.
That's right.
Potentially. Yeah.
So I guess I'll meet you halfway. We can keep the Senate if we can double the size of the House.
I got a friend of mine who's the head of the George Washington Library. She's got a radical proposal that would be like that you would sort of expand the Senate too.
Okay.
So that the big states might get 5 senators and the mid-sized states 4, and then the next 3, and then everybody else 2. So that it would still be, but that you would at least, that California, Texas, Florida, New York ought to have a little more say than Wyoming and Delaware.
I mean, it's like totally unrepresentative as it is right now. So if we could get anywhere closer to being more representative of our population and what people actually think in this country, I think that would be a good thing.
All right. Janessa Goldbeck, this was a great conversation. I appreciate it. Look, I think we need the country desperately needs a pastor for patriotism, I call it. And I think the military potentially is the best place to find that person.
I couldn't agree with you more, and I just really appreciate you having me on. We're going to do another tabletop early next year around the 26 elections and what might happen with the military. I'd love to have you.
I'd love to be an observer or whatever. Count me in.
Fantastic. Yeah. Okay, I'll follow up.
All right, Janessa.
Thanks again.